Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. If you can point to the latest and most amazing technology, you can make what had seemed incredible, credible.
Hello and welcome to Season 2, Episode 11 of the Squeaky Wheel podcast. We speak with leading influencers about policy, industry and more across cycling, walking and all other forms of human-scale mobility. My name is Phil Latz and I've been squeaking about various causes for over 40 years.
And I'm Irene McAleese, co-founder of the cycling technology and data company C-Sense. We're a startup on a mission to help cities transform for more cycling and micro-mobility using data. This month, we're excited to be speaking with Associate Professor Peter Norton, who is a historian at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia, USA. Peter has authored two highly successful and thought-provoking books, Fighting Traffic, The Dawn of the Motor Age in the American City, and Autonorama, The Illusory Promise of High-Tech Driving. Peter is also a sought-after keynote speaker who has given his unique perspective and insights on how we got to where we are today at many conferences around the world.
Irene, did you know that Tern has just launched the latest version of their Bosch-powered Vectron e-bike?
Oh, that's the folding one, right?
Yep. Folding e-bikes are interesting. They can swing too far one way or the other. Either they fold up tiny but ride rough, or they ride great but they weigh a ton and they barely fold. But the Vectron bike rides like a full-size e-bike and folds small enough to slide under a desk or into a camper.
Oh, wow, that sounds like a real Goldilocks bike. Hey, I'm looking at a picture of it here and I see that it's got a new type of belt drive.
That's a game changer. Folding bikes get handled a lot through train stations, in and out of cars, and a greasy chain can make a mess. The Gates belt drive is clean, quiet, and maintenance-free.
And does it have a new hub as well?
Yes, that's a Nexus 5 hub, so there's no derailleur to snag when you fold it. It's built especially for e-bikes and it handles the Bosch torque with ease. Put it all together and you've got a folding e-bike that is really the Goldilocks of bikes.
Yes, just right. Hi, Peter. So great to have you on the Squeaky Wheel podcast today. My first question is it fair to claim that the most valuable benefit from studying history is the opportunity to learn from past mistakes and do things differently today and in the future? Is this what motivated you to write your two books, Fighting Traffic and Autonorama, or were there other key motivators?
That was a major motivation, and it's a great pleasure to be with you, Irene, and with Phil today. Other motivations included the fact that I want to get to a future where common sense prevails in streets and mobility. And another motive is that I'm a history nerd. I'm fascinated by all things having to do with the past. But I also think that it is a great way to learn. We as individuals learn from experience. Often we learn the hard way. Imagine if we forgot every bad experience and kept repeating them in our personal lives. Well, we do that collectively, and the collective version of our experience is history. So we need to learn from our history.
Mm-hmm. So, Peter, you modestly described yourself as a history nerd, but you actually are an academic historian at the University of Virginia and have been for many years. So, can you, for our audience, just explain what are the main subjects that you teach and how much of your book content do you actually weave into your own lectures?
Well, I teach the history of technology, history of engineering, with the idea that we can learn a lot from that hard-won experience that can guide us into the future. My students are all engineering students. I teach in an engineering school, and so that makes me feel like I have something of real practical value to offer, not just of academic interest, although it's of that kind of interest as well. I don't speak very much about it in the classroom because I try to keep my classroom relevant to students in all majors, all engineering fields. But certainly when there's something of particular relevance connected to my own personal research, I do talk about it in class.
Mm-hmm. So that's interesting that your students aren't all history students, they're actually engineering students. Has the concept of motordom sort of worked its way into the academic field now that you coined that term?
Well, I reintroduced that term. I used it because I found it in my research. It was very common in North America, the US and Canada, in the early up to the mid 20th century. And it referred to the whole constellation of interest groups, including manufacturers, automobile manufacturers, but also road builders, automobile clubs, dealers, concrete contractors, anyone with a business interest in motor vehicles was included with this term. And so I find it a very useful way to say a whole lot in a single word. It's much easier than saying, listing all the interest groups involved. And so that's why I revived the word. And yes, I've been very pleased to see that once I started using the word myself, some people picked it up.
Yes, yes.
I'm putting a link in the show notes to an amazing video that's had over 11 million views. It's shot from the front of a cable car as it travelled along Market Street, the main street of San Francisco in 1906, just before the devastating earthquake and fire that wiped out much of the city. For the benefit of those listening who have not seen the video, could you briefly describe that video and what it highlights to you, and share your thoughts about street use and transport and how it looked in 1906 in San Francisco compared to today?
So that's a breathtaking film shot from a camera mounted, as you said, on a cable car, a streetcar pulled by an underground cable. So it's very unusual in the sense that it was hard to make a movie camera. It was hard to mount it on a moving platform because it was so sensitive to vibration. But because the cable car runs on smooth rails, it actually works very nicely. And we get a dynamic view of Market Street, the main street in San Francisco, as the cable car passes down it, heading toward the ferry building at the harbor at San Francisco Bay. And we get to see the street in all its vibrant dynamism, all kinds of different uses, people rushing about on foot, on bicycles, on horse-drawn vehicles, an automobile. And we see how a busy city street was 120 years ago.
Irene and I have both watched that video. Irene used the word mesmerizing, which is exactly the thought I had too. But a couple of comments, there seems to be apparent traffic chaos, like pedestrians crossing the street or standing in the middle of the street at will, and seemingly the human-scaled speed, and also, even in 1906, a surprising number of motor cars which are diving in and out. What are your thoughts about those observations?
It can appear chaotic. It's a very busy street, and lots of people are doing what they want to, moving around in the street. There's no engineered in rules, and people hadn't been trained in traffic codes, and whatever traffic ordinance there was in San Francisco at that time would have been very rudimentary. And yet the chaos is remarkably efficient. People get where they want to go. Nobody's waiting at a traffic light when there's no traffic. Nobody is in such danger that they can't cross somewhere. As you mentioned, the vehicles are going slowly, so people have time to judge. And those people who are making these judgments include people walking and the people in the vehicles of various kinds as well. So I would actually call this smart mobility. There's a great deal of intelligence involved, and it's applying the extraordinary cognitive capacities of the human brains of the people moving around. I think engineering has prepared us to underestimate the human brain relative to machine power, but human beings' brains are clearly much worse than computers at calculation and computation, but they excel at real-world judgments in the physical world, movements, judging distances provided the speeds are human scale speeds.
Interesting.
Peter, we'd like to ask some specific questions about your books, and I'll start with Fighting Traffic. In the introduction and the first 3 chapters of Fighting Traffic, you tell multiple stories of how American society did not automatically accept the onslaught of cars taking over their roads and cities, resulting in a fight back via the growing auto, oil, and road industries, who, as you just described earlier, can be broadly described as motordom. If you had to name just a couple of tipping points or key reasons why motordom overcame strong societal objections, what would they be?
Well, you're absolutely right, Irene, that there were multiple tipping points. If I had to choose one as maybe the most significant, it came about at a very distinct moment in time, circa 1923 to 24, when motordom recognized that if they continued with the predominant view about who's responsible when someone is injured or killed in traffic and who's at fault for traffic congestion, that they were going to doom themselves to a small share of the urban market. In other words, lots of Americans who could afford to buy a car, but who lived in a city, including a small city, would never buy one because they didn't need it, and because there was no room to park it, and because they were in constant peril of being in trouble for injuring or killing a pedestrian. And if they wanted to be safe and to drive safely, they would have to drive so slowly that it didn't make sense to even buy a car. And this was the situation that motordom found itself in. You see, until then, until about 1923, motordom, and that meant at that time particularly local groups like the auto clubs and the auto dealers, they were interested in supporting efforts to reduce the number of people getting injured or killed, and in supporting efforts to prevent too much traffic downtown, because they saw it as in their interest to ensure that the automobile was not perceived as a big problem. But when they joined in those efforts to reduce the number of injuries and deaths on city streets and to relieve traffic congestion, increasingly they found themselves paired off with people who wanted to restrict cars. They wanted to restrict how many there could be by, say, banning curb parking, people who wanted to make traffic safer by preventing cars from going fast. And one of the reasons why I chose 1923 as this transition point is that there was a proposal. It was actually a proposal made in numerous cities, but it went furthest in Cincinnati, Ohio, where there was demand by Cincinnatians to require every driver in the city to equip their car with a mechanical speed governor, a device that would make it impossible to go faster than 25 miles per hour.
Wow.
That was widely supported. 42,000 Cincinnatians signed petitions to put that on the ballot as a ballot initiative to vote on. And that really frightened motordom because they thought, well, if this is where we're going, then we're looking at a future where people won't want a car because they can't use it for what it's best at, which is driving fast. And so that was a watershed. That was a transitional moment.
Wow. Yeah, because it wouldn't be that attractive if they could only drive 25 miles an hour everywhere. And so therefore, how are they going to sell more of these things? In chapter 4, you document the rise of the traffic engineer, who often came from water utilities or railroad backgrounds and prioritized more and faster vehicle throughput above all other considerations, particularly in your home country of America. How many people do you think even realize the extent to which the traffic engineering norms and mantras have actually transformed their cities and their daily lives?
Well, traffic engineering was really invented in response to this problem where people driving were causing injury and death and where cities did not have room for automobiles. And that was the most true of the older U.S. cities where there were tall buildings and narrow streets and just no room for cars to park. Now, engineers have employers. There are people who pay for them. And what the engineers sought to do depended a lot on who hired them to do it. And in the early years, and I mean the 1920s in the US, their employers were usually downtown business associations, chambers of commerce, the groups that represented the retailers and other business enterprises that were located downtown. They would hire the engineers to make recommendations, and they wanted the engineers to find ways to get as many people into the center of the city as possible
Oh,
so that, say, the downtown department store would continue to have plenty of customers. And usually what the engineers recommended for that kind of client was a combination of restricting curb parking so that you would discourage people from driving in favor of modes of transportation that carried more people, such as, in particular, the street railways, which carried lots of people. In larger cities, they carried the overwhelming majority of people going into the city. But also other rules, like rules that would permit more traffic to pass through an intersection and permit people to find parking by a kind of rationing. By that I mean time limits on free parking would at least make sure that the limited parking capacity was shared more. So these people were really interested in efficiency, and they had good examples from earlier problems like supplying water, like supplying electricity, like supplying sewer capacity. Those precedents gave them a model to follow, and it was an efficiency model. In other words, how can we get more done with the same amount of capacity?
that's really interesting because these days we know that when people cycle or walk through cities, they're actually much more likely to stop and spend money in shops and different areas. But then the thinking was more cars would help with that development.
Well, that's interesting because you're right. The retailers, the shopkeepers, the department store managers, and so on usually thought that the best way to maximize the number of customers was to be very welcoming of drivers and to permit curb parking. But the engineers actually showed them by actually counting the number of people going into the shops and conducting surveys and asking customers to fill out little cards that asked them how they got to the shop and so on. They gave the shopkeepers and the business associations convincing data that the more you welcome drivers, the fewer customers you have, because the overwhelming majority of customers arrived by streetcar and on foot. Those were not different modes. Walking and streetcar use was a sort of combination mode. The streetcars made walking practical, really.
Yeah.
And this did change a lot of minds. For example, Chicago banned curb parking in 1926 when the engineers showed the business associations that letting lots of people drive around actually reduced the number of customers who could reach their doors. So that debate that you referred to, Irene, where we know that often a shopkeeper is anxious about bike lanes because they fear it will limit the number of drivers who can park, we can actually show them usually that welcoming cyclists and pedestrians means more business, not less. Well, that old dichotomy goes back 100 years or more.
Well, fascinating that debate has been going so long, and that was used by a group of people that had a definite agenda there. And also, as you know, we were lucky enough to speak with Professor Wes Marshall on the last podcast, and he talked a lot, obviously, about traffic engineers, but hadn't realised the context that often that they were paid by particular groups to argue a case. So that's really fascinating.
You can really watch their message change as their sponsors change, as their patrons change. So they're very responsive to their patrons. If their patrons are in motordom, they give you a very different kind of expert-looking report. The funny thing is, no matter who their customer is or who their patron is, the reports they issue always look like pure science or applied science. But the recommendations are remarkably different because they know which side their bread is buttered on.
Wow. So in chapter 8, you turn to safety. There are some staggering examples of victim blaming. in there, such as that the American Automobile Association actually largely took over safety education in schools and used it as a method of spreading their, shall we say, propaganda. It's a bit like putting a fox in charge of the hen house, isn't it?
Oh, yes. I think that's a perfectly fair analogy. And you said that well. They really took over safety education. And they took over safety education because they needed some way to make it possible for drivers to drive around the city without having to brake their car all the time or having to drive, say, less than 20 or 25 miles per hour. And there was no way to let drivers sort of relax as they drove and go faster as they drove without endangering children. And the death toll among pedestrians in general and children in particular was really shocking. And besides being a human catastrophe, for motordom, it was also a business problem. And so they needed a way to keep children off the street, really. And by taking over safety education and teaching children to stay out of the street, they did serve that purpose. Now, I want to be fair. The fact of the matter is, as long as people really were going to be driving around at 30 or more miles per hour, children really did have to lose their right to the street. But there are other ways of managing this problem, and the previous way had been to restrict the driver instead of restricting the pedestrian and the child.
One of your key conclusions at the end of the book is that to win the battle, groups must organise and campaign together, as motordom successfully did, particularly from 1924 onwards, that tipping point. Are you seeing signs of this collaboration amongst active travel advocates today taking that level of sophistication that motordom did?
Yes, I am. When I wrote the book, I did not expect to see so much in that direction as I have seen since the book came out. Now, you referred to the propaganda of motordom, and I think that's a perfectly fair word for it. Well, the propaganda of a century ago took a lot of resources. You had to, say, buy space in a newspaper or issue press releases through a professional agency of some kind. You had to have a public relations office. And later on, as broadcasting became a major mode of propaganda, you needed even more resources to buy airtime on the radio or on television. Well, since the decline of broadcast television and broadcast radio in favor of less expensive means of getting information out, we have seen a real empowerment of groups interested in active mobility, in shared space, in walking and cycling and transit. They have found new ways to get their message out and to unite and join forces together. It doesn't take very much to produce a viral video, for example, if you're good at that kind of thing. And so coalitions have formed that really couldn't form even just 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah, that's exciting. And actually, it was only a couple of weeks ago I saw that one of the advocacy groups here in Australia, Better Streets, had a webinar by some experts in PR and social media, actually training the advocates in how to use these tools to get their message across. Is there anything else that you would like to see happen in this area?
Oh, a lot. I think there's so much more we can do. And despite my optimistic statement about new ways to organize for the proponents of common sense, we're up against new levels of propaganda for perpetuating the status quo and for misrepresenting perpetuating the status quo as progress. The heavy selling of high-tech driving as if it's offering us something new troubles me because, in fact, it's really only an effort to perpetuate what's already proved a failure, which is everybody going around in their own car for everything. Certainly people can go around in a car for some things, but we've seen really efforts to make driving not just a way to get around, but for many of us, the only practical way to get around. And automating such a system does not help it. It's a kind of symptom treatment that neglects the underlying condition. So there is much more we need to be doing, and the struggle remains a very difficult one.
Well, you've just segued, Peter, exactly to Autonorama. So we'll talk about that book now. I'll ask you a couple of questions about Autonorama. And the book is structured around 4 eras. You call 4 consecutive Futurama eras. So can you start by describing what you mean by Futurama and the life cycle of each era, from utopian promises through to perhaps a slightly different end reality?
Well, this begins with a really ingenious discovery that success in selling cars means really ultimately selling driving as the way to do everything. So until the 1920s in the US and somewhat later in most of the world, the automobile was sold primarily as a tool. And I think we've all heard the expression, you choose the right tool for the job. A certain tool is not right for every job. And the automobile was really perceived that way. You had a car as a pharmacist's delivery vehicle or a grocery delivery vehicle, or you had a car as a pleasure vehicle for the Sunday drive, for doctor's visits. In other words, the car was a tool for certain jobs. And as long as it was only a tool for certain jobs, there was a limit to how many would be sold. And so in the 1920s, really first at General Motors, some smart people figured out that they could sell way more cars if they said, no, this is not a useful tool. This is a necessity, an all-purpose necessity for all transport jobs. And if that sounds like something ridiculous that you can't work because you could never find all the parking you need, and it would never be safe enough because of all the people in the street, well, that's where the second part of this ingenious transformation comes in. And that was promising people that there is a future where everything will be perfect and everyone's driving everywhere for everything. And then the challenge becomes to sell that future. And if you can sell that future, you sell everything you need to get to it. Now, I want to stress that I don't think this future is actually possible. In other words, you can't have a future where driving everywhere for everything at every time and getting there without delay is safe, efficient, and affordable and practical for everybody. But it doesn't have to be realistic. It just has to be something that you can make credible. And this is where the technology comes in, because if you can point to the latest and most amazing technology, you can make what had seemed impossible or what had seemed incredible, you can make it seem credible. This was beautifully said by Arthur C. Clarke, the man who wrote the screenplay for 2001: A Space Odyssey back in 1968. In that same year, he said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And by that, he meant that healthy skepticism we usually have when we're confronted by a really ingenious magician or conjurer, we drop that. And the magic of amazing technology has that effect on us. Only the technology that's most amazing in our time has that effect. So right now, it includes LiDAR and connectivity, 5G, sensors of various kinds. This kind of technology is amazing enough that people who want to sell us car dependency can point to it and say, ultimately, it will all work. There was a generation of technologies in the past that served this purpose for different generations. If we go back a century, it was radio technology. If we go back 60 years, it was transistors, solid-state electronics. If we go back about 40 years, it was microprocessors. So each generation has had a technology that's so impressive that you can use it to claim that car dependency will finally work when we put it into effect. And it has never worked. I don't think it's ever really meant to work. It's simply meant to convince us to keep on this treadmill of transport consumerism.
Okay, so I'm going to play devil's advocate for a minute. So if you'll excuse me while I reel off a few stats. I suspect that engineers from Waymo or their autonomous vehicle competitors / colleagues around the world if they read your book and they would claim, but this time it's different, those other times, but now it's different. And just a few stats before you comment. Waymo to date have raised over US $12 billion in capital for product development. Their daily ridership has grown fast, and today it's at a significant scale. In the safety section of their website that we'll link to in the show notes, they claim that up to June 2025, their autonomous taxis had driven 96 million miles, which is 153 million kilometres, across San Francisco, LA, Phoenix, and Austin. And they claim to be experiencing 91% fewer serious injuries or worse, as they describe it. Presumably worse must mean deaths, but they choose the word worse over deaths. And that's involving passengers of the cars. 92% fewer pedestrian crashes with injuries and 78% fewer cyclist crashes with injuries. So at first read, this all sounds very rosy. What do you think?
It is very impressive. I am impressed. Their record impresses me. What it doesn't tell us is how do we get to the best mobility future of safe, efficient, affordable, practical, everyday mobility. I say that, and I'm impressed by Waymo, and I've been their guest as a speaker, but I say to them what I'll say to you and your audience, which is that you can create an illusion of a successful technology if instead of expressing success in the usual way, which is cost efficacy, that is an effective system that you can also afford, they just drop the cost part of that equation and give you efficacy. Because to make those statistics that you just referred to, Phil, requires an enormous expenditure of money to the point that every single Waymo ride costs Alphabet, the company that owns Waymo, it costs them money. We don't know how much. They won't be frank about how much it costs them, presumably because it's not so flattering. We don't know exactly how much a single Waymo car costs, but it costs several times what a equivalent human-driven car costs. We're getting an illusion also of so-called autonomous driving because, of course, for reasons of safety, these cars require remote supervision. The number of people per car has not been clear. Is it one remote supervisor per car or two cars per supervisor or three? We don't know. But this is a very, very expensive illusion. So if you can have an unlimited budget, and Alphabet has given this an unlimited budget, then you can create an illusion of an effective system, just like if I had an unlimited budget, could, say, take a dirigible for my next vacation, even though it's not the most cost-effective way to get there.
Okay, a dirigible being a airship.
Right.
Hey, you just said something. I just want to back up a minute because you just said you've been Waymo's guest as a speaker. Was that like going into the lion's den, or you just please elaborate on that a little bit?
So Waymo is a smart company, and a smart company is interested in making sure that they've shown that they've been good citizens and are striving to do the right thing, and that they listen to their critics. And also, they're also courting people who can give them credibility. So if you're a YouTuber and you talk about technology, as they've done with several YouTubers of this kind, they would love to have you say very favorable things about Waymos, and some of them have. And so you can be their guest and give them a glowing review. But even if you don't give them a glowing review, and I just didn't give them a glowing review, they still get something from this conversation. They get to say, we are listening to our toughest critics, and we're working to try to take into account what they have to say. So now the talk I gave to them was a private talk to Waymo's policy team, and so it's not even publicly available. But I do give them credit for inviting me in, even though I'm not persuaded that they are the future. I give them credit for listening to their critics.
Very interesting indeed. So in your conclusion chapter of Autonorama, you say that Motordom is using autonomous vehicles to shape the narrative and maintain the primacy of car-dependent cities. rather than more environmentally and socially sustainable alternatives. Can you please paint a picture of your alternative vision, what you think might deliver better overall outcomes compared to autonomous vehicles everywhere?
I think there is a common sense we all share that says if you can find a simple way to do something, that's probably going to be the better one. It's a kind of Occam's razor of technology. So Occam's razor says if you have multiple possible explanations, the simplest is not necessarily the correct one, but it's the one that you should consider first. It's the one with the greatest likelihood of being a good explanation for something. And you should be cautious about very elaborate explanations that require lots of circumlocutions or caveats of various kinds. Well, there's an analogous Occam's razor for technology where, given the choice between hyper-complex systems that require technology we don't even have yet and require massive, expensive investments over the long term, and something more feasible with technology we already have, there are great advantages in the latter, in the simplicity of the latter. This is certainly not my idea. It's an idea that I think maybe was expressed best in Small is Beautiful, a book that came out over 50 years ago by E.F. Schumacher, where he says, so many of the problems we have are due to us pursuing expensive and complex approaches to relatively simple problems. So to finally get to a more direct answer to your question, Phil, I would say let's begin with the simplest form of transportation we have, the one that's available to most, if not all of us, even children, which is walking. And for those of us who can't walk for various reasons, we have things we can do to give such people something like equivalent mobility. If we begin at that level and then build from there, we find that so many of the complex and expensive problems that we try to deal with through high-tech and future-tech automation, most of them go away. For example, if you want a place that's walkable, a community that's walkable, the thing you can do that will help that the most is just permit shops to locate near residences. And I say permit advisedly because in the US in particular, but also in many other countries, it's often not even legally permissible to have a shop, a grocery store in a residential area. Or it may not be permissible to have a small apartment building for 4 families in a residential area. Or it may be mandatory, whether people want it or not, to have off-street parking. That may be a zoning ordinance that requires that. When if we didn't require it, that same parking could be recommitted to local destinations like shops that people could then walk to such that they wouldn't even miss the parking that's no longer there. So legalizing proximity, which also gives you affordable housing, which also promotes walkability, which gives you huge health benefits, which saves money as well. So here's another advantage to simplicity is that when you've solved one problem in a simple way, like walkability, you, without even trying, solve other problems like health and affordability. So there's opportunities to apply simple common sense in an unglamorous way. And proximity is probably the single most important thing you can do. It's not feasible everywhere. Some people have to live in the country. Some people have to live in a remote area or prefer to. But there's so much more we can do in that direction, and it is an affordable way to go. It's also a way that appeals to people of diverse political values, like the conservative who doesn't like intrusive government gets to have a place where zoning rules don't dictate that they must have off-street parking, while a person of more progressive or liberal values welcomes the affordability and equity that come with those kinds of measures.
It sounds so simple and so logical when you explain it like that, Peter.
The simple solutions are often the best, but I think it's really interesting looping back to what you were talking about, the cost efficacy, the cost of these autonomous vehicles, the amount of money that's being poured into that. yet we can't do some basic things like just sort of fix the pavements and footpaths, as we call them here in Australia, so that they're in good condition so that people can always walk around. I do have something to ask you as well. I've noticed that we've been using the term autonomous, but I've sort of picked up that over the last few years, there's been a shift in language from autonomous to automated cars. Could you touch on that? Have you noticed that trend firstly? Maybe this is just in the kind of, it is very niche and very maybe academic, but could you maybe discuss that shift and what might be underpinning that? I think that could be interesting.
I'm very glad you asked, Irene. I personally never use autonomous to talk about cars that drive without a human behind the steering wheel because to me, they are in no sense whatsoever autonomous. And the very word, I think, is one of the reasons why we get ourselves into trouble. Because the word autonomous is an impressive word. And I think of it as a means of deploying that effect that Arthur C. Clarke talked about when he said that advanced technology is like magic. If a machine is autonomous, it seems super capable, maybe flawless or hyper-rational. Now, of course, what autonomous literally means is capable of doing what it wants to do, having self-control. If a person is autonomous, we say that that person gets to choose her own life and what she wants to do with her time or what he wants to do with his time. A autonomous car, so-called, is the opposite. A successful robotic car, and that's all it is robotic, is a car that only does what its human programmers and its human operators want it to do, which means that quite literally it is the opposite of autonomous. And so far from being an academic distinction or a niche distinction or a distinction that only experts might care about but everybody else can just ignore, I would say this distinction is the fundamental issue with robotic cars. We need to call them robotic cars because that's really all they are. They're robotics, and robotics are very impressive technology. But when we call them autonomous, we mislead people about what they can do. A truly autonomous car, let's say you summoned it with your phone and you wanted it to take you to the coffee shop, and you tell the car, okay, take me to the coffee shop. An autonomous car could say, I don't feel like it. That would be autonomy. We want a car that is not autonomous. And I have had engineers, I work in an engineering school, as I mentioned, and I've had engineers say to me, well, look, Peter, I understand your objection, but let's be clear, we're talking about autonomous in the engineering sense of the word only. That's a specialized sense, so just could you bear with us on that? And at first I did. At first I said, okay, you have your special use of the term. But after that request, I wanted to know how that word got into engineering. And actually, it was engineers themselves who basically said what I just said. The first time that word got into engineering, as far as I'm able to determine, is when the U.S. Air Force was requesting contractors to come up with a design for a space capsule. This is 60 years ago. They said they wanted a space capsule capable of full autonomy. And what they meant was a space capsule with a window in it that the human crew could use for celestial navigation by the stars with sextants so that they would be autonomous from signals. They would not be dependent on signals from Earth. They would be autonomous because the human crew would be piloting it. So, of course, this means that a truly autonomous car, by the engineering definition, is the one that I think all three of us have driven around before, the one that can't drive itself. That's an autonomous car when it has a human being in it. I fear that autonomous really sort of amplifies or magnifies or distorts what robotics can actually do.
Yeah. So thinking of it as robotics, then it makes me think of what's known as the trolley problem. So this is where a decision has to be made in terms of if there's going to be a crash, say, and there's the life of the driver could be taken, say, for example, or the life of the cyclist. Somebody has made a decision in the mix, in that algorithm, as to how that's going to play out. It's kind of scary, isn't it?
You're absolutely right. That problem is the trolley problem. a lot of people think of the trolley problem as an abstraction that we haven't actually had to really apply in real life, but we have. And because the people who get to make these decisions are the same people who want to sell us robotic cars, they make that kind of a decision in a way that reflects that business interest, which is not necessarily the same as the decision we would make if we had a sort of hyper-rational, hyper-ethical decision body behind this. An example of this, lethal misapplication of trolley problem thinking, goes back to 2018 when Uber had a robotic car division and they were operating robotic Ubers in Arizona. And one of these robotic Ubers, they had a human safety driver behind the wheel who was supposed to be ready to take over at any time. But because that job was so dull, predictably the driver's attentions were often distracted. Well, we know when one of those vehicles in 2018 detected and then struck and killed a pedestrian named Elaine Hertzberg in Tempe, Arizona, that vehicle detected Elaine Hertzberg significantly several seconds before impact and never even applied the brakes until after impact. And we know why, because Uber rationally said, and I mean rational in the business sense of the word, they said, well, we're not going to convince people to get in a driverless Uber if the car is applying the brakes every few feet. That would just be frustrating and they would never even get to their destination. So we need an Uber that will not be hyper cautious. We need an Uber that's prepared to take risks. And that's why Elaine Hertzberg died. Now, fortunately, we've seen a different calculus at Waymo, but because that calculation is much more cautious than the calculation that Uber made, Waymo is going to keep losing money on every single ride, giving us a kind of expensive illusion of what mobility could look like, even if it isn't cost effective.
Peter, that's such a great answer and so much food for thought in that. But listen, we are coming to the end of our conversation. Is there anything that we didn't ask you that you would like to share with our audience?
Oh, there's so much we could say about this. I think if I had to say one more thing, it might be that the people who tell us the history of the automobile, especially in the US and in Canada, but also throughout the world, tend to tell us versions of this history where the moral of the story, so to speak, or the lesson of the story is that, well, car dependency may not be perfect, but it's what people wanted. It's the result of people's choices, of mass demand, of consumer demand in a free market, democratic choice, or technological progress. It's what people wanted. And what I find is that the history is a lot more interesting than that and actually shows us that people were questioning this every step of the way. It was very hard to convince people to go along with this vision of car dependency being a desirable future. And I think it really helps us to go back and actually look at the historical record because it reveals that we have always wanted to do better. While driving has always been attractive and car ownership has been attractive for those who can afford it, we have always also wanted walkable, bikeable, transit-friendly cities. People vote with their feet, so to speak, every day when they go for their vacation from car-dependent places. Say in the US, if they travel, it's typically to a place where they can walk. And this is a sign that people really do want walkable, people-friendly, human-scale cities.
That's so good to remember that, isn't it? When you're up against those ideas that, it's just the way it is with cars and actually it doesn't have to be and it hasn't always been that. So great note to end that on.
Indeed. Yes, we've run out of time. So Peter Norton, thanks for squeaking.
It's been a joy being with you both today. And may I just add that I'm not used to speaking to interviewers who are so well prepared. It's a real pleasure. I'm used to having to tell people what's in my work, but you saved me that burden, so thank you.
It was our pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What an amazing thinker Irene Peter Norton is. I love it in our Squeaky Wheel podcast when we get unique insights and hear unique perspectives. And that's what I think we got today.
Yeah, I mean, Peter is extremely well known and very well respected. And so it was an absolute honor to have him on the podcast. I love that he's obviously thought extremely deeply about these issues, and every answer was very considered. I need a bit more time actually to process it all, because I think that there's quite a lot that he packed into that discussion. It's probably one that I'll like to listen to myself on a replay.
Indeed. Well, hey, that's got to boost our numbers by one. That's a good idea.
Yeah.
But I think the comments at the end about building from the simplest and walking being the simplest technology. And I was thinking, yes, but Nike, who's going to sponsor that? Unfortunately, walking doesn't have the same sort of money as all these glamorous autonomous vehicles or automated vehicles, as we should be saying. So it's such common sense, but that's what worries me, I guess, is where's the money to boost that particular solution. We're coming to the end of our podcast, but as always, before we go, we finish with What's Up, a chance to tell you what we've been up to and any news you might be interested in. What's up, Irene?
Something that caught my eye is that the Kangaroo Point Bridge, and you'll recall we spoke about the opening of that, which was actually back in December last year. Can you believe?
Absolutely. I took progress photos of it being built, and then I rode and walked across it soon after it was opened. Amazing bridge.
So they have, with the 1 year sort of anniversary coming up, have released some stats. And apparently there's been more than 3 million trips.
My goodness.
So there's walking and cycling across that bridge, which is fantastic. Approximately 10,000 trips a day being made across that bridge. So that's pretty good for Brisbane, considering Blackfriars Bridge in London, which is, one of the biggest success stories for, the uptick of cycling. It's getting, around 2,000 to 6,000 per hour. So I think that's pretty good for Brisbane to be getting 10,000 a year. 10,000 a day on that bridge. So well done.
Absolutely.
And it's also a nice segue for me to announce a new strategic partnership that CSense has formed with EcoCounter, which is actually the company which has deployed that counter on the bridge. So EcoCounter, some of our listeners in Europe may be very familiar with them, maybe some in Australia as well, but they're the biggest counting technology company in the world. They're not only in Europe, but also US and here in Australia. So we're going to be their partner for the Australian market, which is really nice that we can now have at CSense all forms of cycling data, from counting right through to the sophisticated on-bike sensor data that we gather at CSense. So, a nice use case in something like this bridge is to say, well, it's great to know how many people cross that bridge. That's a really useful stat. But then cities need to then know, how do you build out the network so that people know how to come onto that bridge and they feel safe and comfortable traveling across the network. And that's where the data that we provide is really complementary to the more counting solutions. So that's some big news from us.
Excellent.
And we're just really busy end of year. We've got 2 big projects wrapping up. So one was the Helsinki project we've been working on with the data collection on the e-scooters for their Vision Zero project. So there should be a press release coming out about that soon. So some really good, interesting results from that. Another project we have been working on in Dublin is wrapping up. So that's also been really interesting. So there'll be some news coming out about that soon. And kicking off 2 new projects, one in Sydney with the City of Sydney, one with Surf Coast Council in Victoria, which I mentioned on I think it was the last one, that we won the funding from iMove to deliver those projects. So they are underway. We're recruiting for cyclists in those places at the moment. So if you would like to get one of the CSense lights and you live in those areas, keep an eye out for the launch materials for that and pop your name in the hat to hopefully get selected for the project. So that's us.
Well, there's never a dull moment at C-Sense. That's all I can say. In the centre of the universe, I think. So my What's Up will be much more boring and pedestrian. I had a 12-day road trip to Gundawindi in Queensland, which most listeners probably won't have heard of or know where it is. That's fine. You can Google it. On the way up, I stopped at the new bicycle ramp on the northern side of the Sydney Harbour Bridge that's almost completed and ready to open. There I recorded a brief promotional video for our West Marshall episode. And a shout out to our new podcast promotion coordinator, Mark Ames of Strategic Cities, who did a great job editing that video. Because I was driving a car and a trailer on my way to Gundawindi, I had to park a long way from that Harbour Bridge site. I had my first rides on the new 20-inch Lime bike, which was really good, electric shared bike. Small wheels are a good option for e-bikes, I think. And it was interesting to contrast the urban design and transport landscape of central Sydney with Gundawindi and the other country towns along that long drive to get there. Wide roads, less traffic, car-centric, hardly any electric cars, where there's tons in the cities now. Toyota Land Cruiser with a bull bar is the standard stock of trade up Gundawindi way. But interesting to see, it's a year since I've been there. They have lowered their speed limits. They've put in a couple of curb extensions, not many, but a couple, traffic islands to make it easier to cross as a pedestrian. But still on the main street, there's signs where it's just crying out. They've got these little speed humps on the corner and mid-block, and it says, give way to cars facing the footpath either side. Where it's just morally, it's a pedestrian crossing. It's the middle of the main shopping street and cars often do stop. So there's lots of potential for active travel improvements in country towns, I would say, Irene.
Yeah, what always strikes me in those country towns is just how wide the roads are.
Oh, yes.
At first thought, you might think, oh, if the road is really wide, that's safer because it means that there's more space for people to walk around. But of course, it actually means that cars travel faster, right? I think that's the research.
And it takes a longer time to walk across the road.
Longer time to walk across the road. And so the thinking was all about wide roads, whereas actually now we know that narrowing the roads is better for safety for so many reasons.
Not to mention heat sinks, because, my God, it's hot out there.
Yeah, so maybe they should fill them all in with trees a bit, narrow the roads,
Well,
put some
indeed.
trees, put some seats around and do more. Yeah, I was going to say al fresco, but you definitely need the trees there because it's so hot.
What a good idea. If you've liked what you've heard, please subscribe via your favourite podcast platform. We're planning to release one new episode per month on the third Thursday of each month, but not in January because it's Christmas time and Irene and I are going to take a holiday.
And please also leave us a review or a rating on your preferred platform. This is extremely helpful in boosting the algorithms on Apple Podcasts and Spotify that will help get the word out about the podcast. You can also find out more about the Squeaky Wheel podcast and contact us directly via our website, squeakywheelpodcast.com.
Thanks, Irene. And not until next month, but until next year, keep squeaking.
Bye, everyone.